Nightingale. Nightingale closed her eyes and inhaled deeply of the pungent aroma. It permeated a large, open-plan room that was full to the rafters with busy people. The smell that reached her olfactory senses was as old as time, one of warm sweat, saturated with hormones of excitement and anticipation. She smiled. It was a scent that instantly brought her pleasure, a very human scent. "They stink," her companion grumbled. "Do none of them know how to wash?" The petite brunette opened her eyes and smiled up at her friend. "Don't be such a misery, Marcus. You make it sound like a new phenomenon, the great unwashed." She raised her slim fingers in quotation marks around the last two words. "They're just having fun. How should we?" The tall greying man harumphed under his breath in disagreement. "We have responsibilities," he grumbled. "You especially." The woman smiled quietly to herself, amused by his brusqueness. He was so stuffy for one so young. In her day, the streets had been drenched in this smell. There had been no Calvin Klein, no Chanel, no Lynx effect. Just good old honest sweat, with the occasional whiff of lavender should a noble walk past. She sighed slightly. Yes, many years ago. She caught herself running a hand up her neck to a new, fashionably short hairstyle. Smells weren't the only things that had altered over the years. Gone were lacy bonnets and demurely covered heads. Now the sky was the limit with all manner of cuts and colours. The room around them was a testament to that, with all sorts of punky styles and bright primary colours. Hair wasn't the only thing that shortened in length for women. When had it become acceptable for rooms to become so full of legs? There were stripy ones, netted ones, bare ones, painted ones. Again she smiled quietly to herself. She just knew what would be going through Marcus's mind at this moment. Thoughts of puritanical horror. She actually let out a chuckle. "Nightingale?" "Nothing," she smiled. Marcus's grey eyes knitted together. "You seem distracted." Nightingale's eyes scanned the room, and she drew another long breath. "It's okay. There's none in here. You need to relax. Enjoy yourself a bit more. You'll have a long, tedious existence if you spend it all uptight. Is that an order?" The woman cocked her head to one side and raised an eyebrow. "Does it need to be?" Marcus was about to reply when a youth wandered up to him and said, "Whoa, guys! Love the outfits." Nightingale raised a single eyebrow at the 20-something, clad in what appeared to be a number of old potato sacks, stitched together to make a rough tunic, which was, in turn, covered by an improvised green cloak fashioned from a blanket. He wore by his side a small plastic sword, and he apparently had an aversion to shoes. "I thank you," she smiled politely, unaware that Marcus and she had actually come in costume. "No worries," beamed the ad hoc, whatever he was. "Your Alex from Being Human is almost perfect. And as for Vincent Price there, well," he clapped his hands together and beamed from ear to ear. Nightingale dipped her head slightly, trying not to burst into fits of giggles, as she felt Marcus fuming silently by her side. The youth did have a point. There he was, dressed in his impeccably smart suit, with a freshly pressed shirt and sporting a silk cravat. Give him slightly wilder hair and a manic stare. It'd be quite appropriate, all things considered. She gave a demure smile and gently steered Marcus away before he suffered an apoplexy. "Come now, Vincent dear," she whispered. "Don't you dare," he blustered. "I look nothing like the man. Nothing at all." "If you say so." Marcus slowly shook his head. His eyes surveyed the room. "What are we doing here?" "You know what we're doing here." Yes, yes. Scorpion had a vision. The word dripped with sarcasm. "But why on earth did she have to have one of a fruitcake party?" Nightingale turned and placed her hands squarely on her hips. Marcus took a small step backwards. "Oh, come on. That's uncalled for," she snapped. "It's just a sci-fi and fantasy convention. They're all harmless. They're having a great time." She smiled as what looked like a walking carpet shambled past them, uttering noises akin to water trying to find its way through a blocked drain. "I think it's kind of fun." "We're not supposed to be having fun," the male grumbled. "We're supposed to be looking for him." "Well, standing round bickering won't find anybody." I'm going to mingle. With that, Nightingale turned on her heel and headed off towards the bar, leaving distraught Marcus stranded on his own, like a banker in a children's nursery at messy time. Nightingale had never been much of an alcohol drinker when she'd been younger. This had been for two reasons. First, her employers had frowned upon staff being anything less than sober as a High Court judge. The slightest whiff of booze on the breath and they would have been out on their ear. Secondly, there had been very little variety to choose from. There was either the brown swill served in alehouses, which tasted of decomposing bread and made hair grow in the most unsightly places, or there were the volatile spirits that crazed alchemist distills in copper pans in a darkened back room. She had known many an inn to go up in flames when the landlord had been trying to perfect another refreshing tonic. So it was that she stood and stared in complete bewilderment at the cornucopia of beverages that adorned the bar in front of her. Why do people need 1,001 ways to destroy their brain cells? She muttered quietly to herself. Probably because they see it as their right. Nightingale jumped slightly. She had been so engrossed in studying the vast array of optics, she had not noticed the man standing next to her. She mentally chastised herself. She had to be more careful. Slips like that led to disaster. What do you mean by that? The question revealed none of the self-admonishment that she was feeling. The man was slightly taller than average, but not as tall as Marcus. His dark brown hair was cut into a sharp, neat style, and he was dressed casually in jeans and a sweatshirt. Altogether, Nightingale found him rather appealing. People see everything as their right these days, he shrugged. They want the right to get fat. They want the right to talk to others as if they are inferior. They want the right to spend their lives watching trashy television. It makes sense that they want the right to abuse their bodies in as many ways as possible. Don't you think that's a rather cynical view of the world? Nightingale frowned. Not everyone's like that. True. Not everyone. Just all those who seem to think the world is their oyster and treat it as something to rip open, so that they can extract a nice shiny pearl. He nodded to the suspended bottles of alcohol. So, what'll be your poison then? Nightingale cocked her head slightly to one side, allowing herself a small smile and a flirty twinkle. Are you buying me a drink? The man nodded. Well, what would you recommend? He appeared to give the matter some thought, then replied, if we were somewhere that actually knew how to mix something of a half decent, I would say that you'd be a martini girl. Gin and vermouth, a splash of lemon oil, accompanied by an olive. Perfection. However, as their idea of a classy cocktail here is Bacardi and Coke served with a bag of pork scratchings, I'd suggest just sticking to a nice dry white wine. Nightingale chuckled. Sounds good to me. He caught the attention of one of the many harassed bar staff and ordered 2 drinks. The wine for Nightingale and a straight vodka and ice for him. Cheers! He saluted after paying and clinked his glass against Nightingale's. So tell me then, what are you doing here? I'm here for the convention. Nightingale lied smoothly as she sipped her drink. It really did taste rather nice. The stranger shook his head. No, you're not. Look around you. All these guys are here for the convention. They're absorbed in it, engrossed in a fancy world, whereas you... You're outside that little glass fishbowl looking in. Nightingale looked at her drinking companion over the rim of her wine glass. His dark eyes were fixed on her. At that moment she was the sole attention of his world. Could he be... I'm looking for someone, she volunteered. A man. A cruel smirk crept into the stranger's mouth, and she knew that she had been mistaken. This was not him. This was just going to be a line something like, well, I guess you found him, sweetheart, or think I'll be man enough for you? What he actually said chilled her to the bone. You'll never find him, vampire. The word hissed into her ears like a curse, and she sat silent, shocked. The stranger leant forward, the smell of alcohol on his breath. You will fail. You will all fail. The divergence is coming, and we are everywhere. The dragon shall rise, and this world will be his. 2 things struck Nightingale simultaneously. The first was one word that leapt into her head. Construct. The second was a sharp knife that plunged into her stomach. Instinct took over. She had been a fool and let her guard down. First, it had walked right up next to her without her realization, then actually sat and flirted with her, without her getting so much of a whiff of its scent. Now she had to start thinking like the professional killer that she was. Quickly she turned towards the bar and, covering the blade from sight, poured it out of her gut in one swift move. She stashed it inside a leather jacket and turned to see her quarry sprinting out of the bar. She pressed her fingers tight against the wound as the skin started to heal beneath her clothes. Nightingale took off in pursuit, careful not to allow her supernatural speed take over and cause a commotion. She had to remain, for all onlookers at least, outwardly human. As she ran across the room, she felt Marcus fall in time with her. What happened? Construct, she cursed. Male, slightly shorter than you, brown hair. I'm guessing he's making for his car. Her voice was strained. You sound hurt. The bastard stabbed me. I'll heal. The two vampires hurried out of the cool night air and breathed deeply. There was the creature's scent, clear as a day that neither of them could walk in. How had she missed it before? Had she been so preoccupied with Scorpion's vision? Obviously she had. She had to make amends. The construct could not be allowed to escape. There was the roar of a car engine turning over, and a red estate flew past them. In an instant, Marcus was clinging to the roof of the car as it swayed across the parking lot, narrowly missing another vehicle that was parked by a tree. Nightingale chased after them, her legs moving in a blur. She too managed to lay a hand on the car as it growled up the incline to the road, but then she felt her grip thrown off along with Marcus as the car spun round a corner. They quickly recovered themselves in time to see a sight that stopped them both dead in their tracks. As the construct pushed his foot to the floor, someone stepped out into the road in front of him. The car did not even slow. It ploughed into the unfortunate bystander and shot off towards the motorway. Nightingale sprang up in the air and descended next to the casualty. He was lying in a heap at the side of the road. His arms were at peculiar angles and his right leg had an extra joint. There was also blood. Lots of it. Oh no, Nightingale gasped as she knelt by the broken body. Nightingale! She bent over and stroked her finger down the man's cheek. He was in one of the costumes that she had seen people wearing in the convention, a blue shirt, dark hair and pointy plastic ears. Nightingale! Quick! He's getting away! It's my fault, she whispered. If I hadn't let my guard down... She paused as she felt a flutter in the man's neck. He's still alive, Marcus. He's still alive. With much care as she could manage, she rolled the bleeding man onto his back. He lay there cradled in her arms, blood flowering on his chest. Oh no, she whispered again. We have to go, Marcus urged, pacing impatiently behind her on the footpath. We can still catch it. The man gave an almost imperceptible groan and his eyes flickered open. He gazed up at Nightingale through rivulets of his own blood and performed the unbelievable. He smiled. We can't just leave him here. Nightingale pressed her fingers against his neck again. His pulse is very weak. We have to. We have a job to do. You will finally find your child. The words sang in Nightingale's head as she cradled the dying man. Tigress was insistent about Scorp's vision. She said I'd find my child. That's why we came here, not to chase some walking lump of clay. Gently she brushed the man's hair away from his wet face. I came here to find you, she whispered so quietly that only another vampire could hear it. That's ridiculous, Marcus hissed. We have to go. Others will be here soon. It's getting late and people will be making their way home. Nightingale shook her head. I'm not leaving him. He's near death. I have to save him. Her voice was icily cold. So now, after all these years, you decide to generate a child here at the side of a road? How romantic, he harumphed. Stop being so stuck up and just keep watch, Nightingale ordered. Then to the man in her arms she soothed. Relax, my child. Soon you will feel no pain. She sank her sharp teeth into his neck to drain him dry. It took very little time as the majority of his blood was already shed on the footpath. The thick red liquid was sweet as it coursed down her esophagus into her stomach. She felt it seep its way into her gut and circulate into her own veins. When she was sure that it was integrated into her own systems, she bit into her wrist and offered the wound up to his mouth for him to drink. At first the recipient just lay still, and the blood could only drip into his slack mouth. But after a moment his jaw began to move rhythmically, and the vampire felt suction against the skin as the blood started to spurt. As Nightingale watched her child feed, she saw his wounds close up and his broken limbs straighten out. Just then, there was the sound of a car ignition from the parking lot. "Nightingale, we have to go, now!" Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder and gently pulled. She looked down at her child despairingly. "He's not finished!" "We'll be finished if people find us here." The new mother looked up frantically and saw attendees of the convention piling out of the hotel. With resignation, she nodded and bent close to her newborn's ear. "Listen to me." Her voice was no more than the wind blowing in the air, but she knew that his new accentuated hearing could pick out every word. "I have to go now, but I will find you. If you remember anything of this, then make sure it is what I am about to tell you." She stilled herself and repeated the three things that every child of Cain was told at its creation. Find the Eternals, protect the twins, await the divergence. Then, as carefully as a mother lies her baby in a cot, she lowered his head to the floor. Nightingale stood, nodded at Marcus, and the two of them vanished into the night as bloody tears streaked down her porcelain face. She had a child now. She would find him again because that was her responsibility. Then, when she had found him, she would train him, guide him in the ways of their kind, and watch him flourish, because that was what mothers did.